All right, Bellular. Let's talk about public
There's
test
also a
rounds.
super here from Walt White that I think has got a lot of value. The cool thing about not having a PTR is that when a new expansion or raid fight comes, you know nothing. Patch day is always blind progression for everyone. Yeah, like as much as so
Not blind. Leaks are still a thing. Not totally blind. Maybe legally blind.
much of the content that we do involves the PTR. If we could have no PTR and actually still have the content, etc., all be good.
Yeah.
So one of the things I think is really interesting about this is if we just talk about in the current context, and one of the complaints about 9.1 is that people thought it was going to be in July or August, and it's actually going to be June 29th, which at the time I'm filming this hasn't happened yet. And the PTR had complaints on it like, hey, I'm seeing this, but I'm really missing the context. You said this piece of content was bigger, and you only gave us a little bit. And they said, yes, there will be more on launch. And so actually pulling back from the PTR is something I've seen a lot with Shadowlands. And it's been to mixed reviews. There are people that wish things were better tested because that's the history of World of Warcraft. And there are people that I'm sure that somewhere in there is some newness in there.
Then I would vote for no PTR.
Same, 100%.
I think it would be better for the game.
I genuinely think it ruins the game.
Yeah, the existence of the PTR hurts WoW.
I only go into the PTR to clear the things that I want to know, and I avoid the rest. So the PTR for Shadowlands launch. I had heard a lot about what crafting and gathering was going to change, and people were making these speculations around relics of the past and how they were going to work, and I wanted to understand in my own spreadsheets, in my own nerding out. And so I do. I have Google Sheets that are made up to kind of mock up my own thing, and that helped me decide if my limited 1 million gold would be able to make a dent, and should I invest in relics of the past, and I chose not to based on my own hesitancy, which turned out to be right, but that's only hindsight. And so hopping on to talk to features, I try not to go places that talk to this. There are a handful of people that get early access to Final Fantasy through a system called the Media Tour. So if Bellular was a Final Fantasy creator, it would not be impossible to think that an EU Media Tour would invite him to come play the game early under an embargo. And NPCs and a lot of things are removed, and you have access to limited zones. So it's not that early access is, it's that we don't go PTR for standard patches, and that the vast majority of the player base does not have a PTR.
Yep.
We should be able to get to a place where they can. Does PTR mostly exist because they want Mythic Raiders to go into the Mythic Raids because they very much care about that stuff?
I think so. It's
Yeah,
also, I think it's just a thing they started because it sounded like a cool thing to do, and they just never stopped.
I think when patch cycles are really long and the PTR comes out at a certain pace, you can use it to test certain things, make sure that certain classes are functioning the way you are. Final Fantasy fans will often say a PTR is devs being lazy because they just want the players to do their job for them. But you have to remember that Final Fantasy, I don't know how many testers they have. Is it 5? Is it 10? Is it 100? You know what it's not? It's not millions. And so when hundreds of thousands or millions of playthroughs of a PTR get done, there are things that just reveal. It's tested across tons of different hardware types. It's tested across tons of different play styles. And there are things that get discovered and get reported back to them. So it's when we're talking about it from a spoiler standpoint, which is their opening volley, it is a downside. That would be the upside.
I'd love to see reasoning from the first time they added PTR to the game.
Yeah, because it's like I've generally liked the open betas and it's all felt.
Yeah.
It's weird. It's like what they literally do with their alphas, betas, and public test realms is like so conducive to hyper open and communicative development.
Yeah.
It's just they give us one half of that, but they don't do the communication bit. That's odd.
Yeah. Just here's
That's true of all of WoW.
half a build of a game. You're like, what?
Yeah, man, kind of wild. I guess in a similar topic, Forbidden Purple saying, didn't Blizz let go of half their QA or more? Wonder why. Laughing my face off.
So when they did the big layoff, the events teams and stuff centered on things like esports, probably helped out a lot with BlizzCon. The QA teams were hit pretty hard because they're not immediately profit centers. In the short term, that didn't really manifest itself because QA works so far in advance, and so a lot of that stuff is tested. We are now seeing as they get into Shadowlands further, You have to wonder if the amount of QA let go and the way QA has been compensated and treated in the past, having met some of the members of the QA team and the more specifically the past QA team, is one of the areas that I think the community team and the QA team is one of the areas that Blizzard has assumed they don't need as much of. And I don't know if they're assuming that because they're like, well, 14 doesn't even have a PTR, so why do we have all this stuff around the feedback of the way this game works? I think they've really struggled in that department. And being part of Blizzard as a whole, when they were coming out with games regularly, I think QA was more justifiable internally because those QA testers, if they needed to, could have been considered to be pivoted to working on other games. But now that they don't release new IP every year, it is an expense. It's a huge expense. And in a profit-driven company, which they are, any publicly traded company has an ethical obligation to manage their shareholders' money well. Bobby and all of those under him have a job to do that is to be profit-driven. And so cutting needless expense is a good thing on its own, but unfortunately, any side of a company that is not tied directly to sales can easily accidentally look like it's costing more than it's gaining because the gains aren't monetary in the short term. It's not easy to see in the short term in one quarter versus the next because we live in a world where the economy is determined in 3-month intervals. It is not easy to see in a single 3-month interval the value of QA. It is something that you look back and you regret. And you regret it years later, not months later, which means that a CEO that has to fight for their job every single year and fight for their raises every single year is not really incentivized to care about what the company does 5 years from now. Publicly traded companies give them access to resources to scale up and to attempt things much larger than private companies. But they give up that control that allows them to look out long term. And it is very rare that a company gives trust to somebody like Square Enix has with Yoshi P. And usually that trust is contingent on performance. Usually that is, you've done well with it, I'll give you a little more. You've done well with it, I'll give you a little bit more. But the moment you have a bad expansion or a bad take, you give up usually months or even years of that loose talk. So when Blizzard first came into Activision said, no, we love Blizzard, we're going to let them do whatever they want. And it was like that until Blizzard was failing to meet the growth goals that they expected. And then they took back a little more control. And a little more control. And that Activision Blizzard parent company, that sister relationship up top, has worked itself its way down every single time they feel that something has been mismanaged.
Well, I know at one point, okay, I remember somebody said this to me, and it was somebody who was like either it was in and around Blizzard, but it was like maybe over a year ago, and I can't actually remember who it is, but somebody basically said that they couldn't field an internal Mythic rating team.
I remember saying that. That was definitely public.
That was public.
I'm pretty sure that was public because I remember seeing that written down.
Yeah, and that blew my mind a bit.
Yeah.
Definitely blew my mind a bit. I don't know if it's the Blizzard don't have enough QA. I don't know.
I can tell you from the ones I've talked to, it was not enough before the layoff. So the layoff is not great.
It certainly sometimes feels like it.
Definitely feels like it. Either they don't have enough QA staff or their QA processes are bad.
Yeah.
Or not good enough.
Hang on, what was it that...
Honestly, to run an effective PTR, you would actually need more QA, not less, because you would need somebody within that to go test the things that are being claimed and go verify those. You have a larger data set, but you don't know what that data set's telling you. You don't know the accuracy of that data set. So that data set of all those reports, I did report things on the PTR to Shadowlands, because if you're going to hop on the PTR, in my mind, you have an ethical obligation by getting early access to the game to, if you run into something you wish was different, it's your obligation to go let them know that. Otherwise, you are giving up the right to then complain that it didn't get better. You were given a chance to share your feedback, and now you're expecting them to respond to feedback you did not give. And so I hopped onto the PTR and I filed a number of reports. I played through the new player experience once, and I messed with Relics of the Past. I filed a report on both. And so I think that I think that the PTR is not a replacement for QA. It is a tool that World of Warcraft, if they are going to leave it in place, should be sure to use, because their PTR, in my opinion, is uniquely one of the ones that has a larger level of engagement, a larger established audience that knows this is where we go, this is where we report, this is where we test. And so in my mind, if they don't want to come out and do things like live letters and interviews at regular intervals like Final Fantasy, the PTR is their place to be transparent. and say, hey, we're not going to come out and make statements to the entire audience, but to those of you that really want to come and meet us halfway and try to tell us what you're not liking, meet us on the PTR, and we'll talk to you there about the changes as content comes your way.
Was the IGN thing where we heard about it was like there was issues in QA and community to the point where developers would have to write patch notes?
Yeah,
that
was the IGN report where they said that was because there's not enough support staff to do that stuff. Actual developers have to take time out of developing to do that.
Well, in that case, how many WoW developers are actually tied down in work that is more the work of QA department?
Yeah.
And is a developer the best person to be writing patch notes in the first place? That statement on its own somewhat might accidentally imply that a developer is more important than a QA person. They are just different. Now, the way they're paid and all that has to do with market and all of that. So yes, a dev might make more money, but importance of the role is different. It's a lot like a manager taking time out of being in the back, poring over the numbers, ordering more supplies, is coming out into the kitchen to make the pizza. Not only is that a waste of the manager's time, but odds are, as much as the manager might by some viewpoints be more important than the cook, they're not as good at making a pizza anyway as the person who makes pizzas all day, every day as their job. Especially when something unique is going on. Imagine there's something weird with the oven. Well, the chef knows that. The cook that's been putting those pizzas in all day knows that. Oh yeah, don't put it on the left side. The left side hasn't, it's been temperamental on temperature. The manager's not going to know that. They're not in tune with that. And so when you talk about patch notes that have sections dedicated to hot fixes, where we're at, known issues, talking about what is changing, leaving somebody in charge whose job it is to say, here's what we did, here was the feedback, here's what we decided to change, and here's what we couldn't get to. Leaving somebody who does that for a living is a better plan. So should the dev know how to write patch notes? Yes. As part of their core job, they should understand what their job impacts. But should they be the one doing it, especially doing it intermittently, that's a problem. So should the manager know how the pizza's made? Yes. But it is a systematic problem if they are regularly having to come out and make pizzas because they fired all the chefs. That's a problem. That is not the sign of a healthy company.
I wonder.
Yeah, it's a kind of case where I would like. Yeah,
I was just going to mention, just people think that QA is just replaying the same game again and again and again and keeping a notebook of bugs. There is some extremely technical QA, and very often, like QA people
I see some people in chat talking about my restaurant analogy. I worked in restaurants for a number of years. Every manager and assistant manager I have worked with that did a good job at their job could do each one of our jobs. But when stuff hit the fan, when the business got really, really busy, they were never as fast and effective. Nobody's going to correct them. They were never as fast and effective as somebody who does exclusively that job all day. And there are other things they can do when the restaurant gets that busy, such as going out and visiting with customers who may be upset at delays, such as going back and seeing why we're running short on food. Did they miss something? There are things that they can do that the person who should be doing the job they're now doing can't do, that make them uniquely qualified. So should they be aware of every job in the game? Yes. Should all the people at Blizzard be aware of the other jobs? Yes. Does it feel like sometimes Blizzard is too big for the people at Blizzard to be aware of where their job fits into the whole? Absolutely. I still draw an issue with somebody being hired at a certain compensation package for a certain skill set to work in a certain job, to not just be aware of how to do someone else's job, but to regularly be asked. To regularly be asked to do that. So I would just say that devs doing patch notes is not a problem because devs shouldn't be capable of it, because devs shouldn't understand it, but because if a dev is taking time away from developing to do a job that someone else should be doing regularly, that's a sign of a systematic problem, whether or not the patch notes come out fine.
Actually they basically do a lot of, I think QA is development. But there's often lots of times where QA people do a bunch of work that is kind of maybe above and beyond what you would assume QA would be.
Yeah, QA
which is just a way
weird.
Of saying that it feels underappreciated.
Yeah, QA is very strange because you have QA like ranging from let's get an intern in to play this same section of game over and over again. This is like the kind of perception of it. But then there's also QA like, hello, automation engineer. who's been automating stuff for 30 years, can you run unit tests in our engine to make sure all this stuff works? Like, can you have someone to sit down with all of the mathematics in the game and figure out, is this, as an example, is this fight mathematically possible with expected DPS output from all this gear, all these classes, all these abilities? Can you put all that in a big spreadsheet? Can you?
There's also something different within tuning that I think the average player doesn't run into, because they're only seeing their one playthrough of the game. They're not doing it across multiple tiers of player caliber and player play time. And so in world first progression, let's talk about Nathria here. There was a time when they were going through the world first race where it was questioned whether or not Sludge Fist was overtuned or Generals was overtuned, because they were seeing the world first guilds struggle through these fights. There were questions about if some of the fights that went down too fast were undertuned, but you have to remember, it's not tuned for one play experience. It's not tuned for everybody to play the one way. First of all, it's going to be clearable with a different amount of knowledge by people who are pulling it blind versus people who aren't. And so mechanics that are opaque are hard on people learning, but are not hard once they're a guide out there in some cases. The other thing is gear. Gear improves over time. And so tuning something for week one progression when you're in best in slot from a previous tier, maybe with 1 or 2 or 3 drops from that raid tier trickled across your party, or whatever, some percentage of your total gearing, raising the average item level in your whole raid group up by just a little bit, is very, very, very different for players who are very good at the game, adjusting on the fly, playing anywhere between 8 and 15-hour days as they go through this progression. It's very, very different in week 1 than it is in week 2, when there's now twice the drops out there. There's more knowledge about the fights out there. Week 3, even more knowledge. Maybe some guides have started to appear. You've got some preferences. You've got some preferred comps. You've got a lot more gear. Maybe the first week your raid group got some particularly bad drops if the game kind of impacts that, or they put it on a player who couldn't show up week 2 or 3, and so that drop is simply not available within the team. And as we talk about getting into weeks 10 and 16, where you talk about it's very well established, there's one or more accepted strategies. At this point, pickup groups, pugs of random players are getting through this content, either because their regular group is not there and they're playing together. There's largely no call-outs, people that are specific to somebody making a mistake, because once they make a mistake, they themselves can call out that mistake. There is a shift in how clear it is. There is a shift in whether or not this party can clear. There's even a shift in mentality. Hey, we wiped twice. I don't think this group can do it. That's very different than week 1. Of course we're going to wipe twice. Nobody knows what they're doing. Nobody knows what's going on. Week 16, what is your excuse? If you can't handle it in 2 polls, I'm out. And so there is a change in the way that content matures. And now you have to look at what happens to that content when it's last cycle or a year ago. Do you want it to have any use? Do you want it to have any value? Are there any mechanics you want to age a certain way, especially as we look at systems like Final Fantasy XIV's Unreal system, where you might want to design fights today with in mind that there may be a day in the future that those fights could be selected to be in Unreal. Should you bake that in now to save some of the labor you're having to do to retrofit these fights into that system? The way these fights are designed on feedback doesn't mean they don't hear your feedback simply because you cannot see or feel the change. They have to think about a lot more points of play. And so Final Fantasy has said they want Savage to be something that is attainable by all players, that it is doable by all players. That does not mean easy. Where do you design this stuff? And so I think in the PTR conversation, you start to talk a lot more about how do they respond to feedback? How do they engage? What is their objective? And I will say that Final Fantasy has done a better job defining what content is designed to do and for who. And World of Warcraft simply says, well, we think it's best and you should trust us. And they haven't done a good job coming out and explaining why. And while you may still be in charge, a lot of times it is really nice, especially now that you're talking about players who have been playing your game in many cases for 10 or even 15 years, to treat us at least like we're a 15-year-old. I'm allowed to drive next year, Mom. Can you at least tell me why I have to go to bed early? Oh, I have to go to bed early because you have a business trip tomorrow and you said so? That's fine. I don't have to agree with it. But can you at least tell me? There are people that know so much about this game that they become devs. Ian Hazakostas came from the WoW community. There is a number of devs on the 14 side that come from this community. They are experts on this game because they started as a player. They're experts in this genre because they've been playing it longer than either of these games have been around. And so saying because I told you so to, you think you do but you don't, are these quotes that tell us you think you do but you don't was a one-time Freudian slip of how they really felt about the player base. Yoshi P in a very similar Freudian slip when a player asked in a slightly aggressive way that, hey, how come your game isn't putting in enough content for me? How come I want to play your game and you don't give me a reason to? And Yoshi P's response was, you can take breaks. That Freudian slip right there, that moment where they tell the player base how they really feel, that's the difference. And that comes through communication, and that comes through bonding in that relationship. And World of Warcraft, while I do believe they care and they want to make a good game, they don't regularly interact with us, and the PTR is their opportunity to. It's their unfair advantage over Final Fantasy. They have a built-in place where they can have that conversation with a giant "this is development material" disclaimer right there on the screen. They're not bound by anything they say in PTR. It is a perfect low-stakes place to tell us what they're thinking and us to take those only as rough draft thoughts. And they don't take it. Final Fantasy does a better job communicating with their player base, and they don't have a dedicated place to do it. So I don't think Final Fantasy needs a PTR, but I don't think World of Warcraft should be looking to give theirs up.
Automate it. Can you run against all the tests, against every known bug in the system, all that stuff? And it just is that range where it feels to me like I feel like almost the best sort of layout for a team is probably having like almost like giving development teams in specific like groups and responsibilities a bunch of interns, not interns per se, but a bunch of like support staff individually to do that stuff. Like it's the kind of thing where I don't know how the teams are set up internally, but it's like, it would be very nice if a system designer had someone they could go to and go, hey, I've been keeping you abreast of how the system works. Could you write a patch notes? Or could you write a quick blue post? I'm going to put this out live on PTR.
And that's where the resources of WoW should really shine. If Ian, for example, is not as comfortable taking time out of his day to communicate to the degree that Yoshi P is, WoW has the backing to hire somebody that is. Somebody that can go around and be a public figurehead and maybe at select intervals do an interview with Ian where they make Ian look good by asking him questions and then clarifying those questions in the ways where his style of communication may fall short for some players. They have the ability to go out and hire shoutcasters or whatever they need to come out and sell us what they came to. They had a choice. They got into a room and they had a bunch of ideas suggested at each juncture in the game. And they had a choice in those. And every single person that said their idea had pros and cons, and they picked one. And then they came out and they said, this is the one, it's the only one, it's all you need to know. Final Fantasy said, it was hard. We've thought of a couple. This is the one we went with, and this is why. Last time we picked one and you guys said that these were the things you didn't like about it, and these were the things you did. We're going to try to keep those things alive. We really like those. We're not sure if we're going to be able to do it in exactly the same way to set expectations or win, but we do respect that you guys liked it. Those things that you didn't like, we think we understand why. We're going to go ahead and say it here so we can get some feedback, and we're probably going to say it a couple more times so that we can get some feedback and make sure we're understanding you. And I'm aware that, yeah, that didn't quite land how we had hoped. Those live letters, those discussions, those interviews, those are the moments that make us feel invested, even though we're never in that room getting to make the decision. Even though as players, we actually have no control over where they take this game. None. People regularly talk about content creators. Well, you're a voice. We're a voice to the community at best. I don't know that devs are ever listening. Maybe. To some of us. They've mentioned that they really like Frosty, and I know they have a close relationship with Mr. Happy. There are these handful that are impactful, but the vast majority of us, I don't get direct feedback. So when people say, well, Brian and Chris suggested something and it's awful, hope the devs don't listen to him. Don't worry. We're not at that table either. But the fact that we hear back from them, it's kind of like when you're muted on a phone call or something and you say something and then somebody happens to respond. You feel like you're heard even though you weren't. The fact that my direct voice does not make it to the devs, but our collective voice does, and if they respond to that is something that Final Fantasy does well, and it's where I think the PTR is uniquely poised to do that for World of Warcraft. And I feel like they just say, hey, we put some changes out, you gave us feedback, now we're going to roll out the patch with or without those changes. And that's not always true. Torghast changed drastically as a result of PTR feedback prior to Shadowlands. I can name examples where that isn't true. But as a feeling, as perception being reality, the PTR leaves too many things unanswered, and so it feels like the bulk of what we say might as well just be thrown in the trash.
But they sit beside them all the time, or would have before COVID.
Well, I guess it's that thing where it's hard to know. It certainly feels like the developers really are not thinking about the PTR, which in a way they should not be. It's just being what's best for the game. So it then feels like you've got all the devs just, doing their work day to day, committing changes.
Yeah.
And, at some point somebody decides like, okay, this is what we're doing for the PTR build. But it's like the developers are actually sitting there doing the frontline development work of the game. It's like they don't have much say. In when things are on PTR, how PTR is done, which then means they probably don't have the communication avenues and angles needed for a bunch of what we would like to see from a PTR.
Yeah.
Which I guess is...
That's a ship being too big to steer. That's the fact that devs can't say, hey, I've got some things I'm working on I'd really like feedback on. Can I get those on the PTR? If it really is true that person can't do that, that's a game that's gotten too big. And them having a lot of resources actually hurting them at that point.
It's brutal, like.
Yeah. That interesting. Oh, man. Yes. Ultimates. I couldn't believe it when I saw this. Ultimates have never needed a hotfix. Is that true? I'll assume it's true.
I'll take their word for it.
Says this is from Shadow Tycho. Yeah. Ultimates have never needed a hotfix and are tuned very tightly. Yoshi P does pug raids with fans occasionally, and when parsed is high orange. So basically, Yoshi P is just ultimate developer.
He actually goes to Western sites to learn how to optimize his gear. I think that bugs are typically addressed. So I don't know if there's ever been hot fixes, and the way things are tuned adjusts as we add more jobs to the game, as scaling changes. So every once in a while I find something in 14 that works a little differently than it did before, and I don't remember it being in the patch notes as somebody that makes videos in the patch notes. So it's possible I just have a really bad memory. But and I don't know Ultimate that well as a piece of content, but it does change. The way UCOB and T and UU will change as we go into the stat squish will change. And so if there's issues with the way people are clearing it now, they could address those then, and we wouldn't necessarily see it. It's also not a progression fight. It's there to be cleared. So it doesn't need a nerf because it's too hard. They just let players get better as long as it's mathematically possible at all. As much as the ultimates are meant to be the hardest difficulty in the game, when I see people discuss which one should I get started with, they're not all considered the same difficulty to progress.
For Chad, it seems, while still remaining humble, perhaps.
Actually is just proper Chad, like.
Yeah, we've got JAO saying FF, well respected, due to how much they multitask. The team who tests the balance and raids works in other departments of FF14 and other Square Enix games.
That's nuts.
That is a level of being cross-functional that seems bonkers to me, but that's pretty cool.
That would make sense with how Square Enix have been like shuffling like people about. I mean, because they always have like they've run into problems out in the past with Nomura trying to do 500 games at once. And I've been like, Nomura, just go and finish Kingdom Hearts 3 and then have a nap.
It's an incredible skill set and incredible level of dedication. It does burn devs out. They run them pretty hard. If somebody says to Square Enix, so if somebody comes into Square Enix and says, I want to burn the candle at a single end, from the outside looking in, it seems that they seem to be okay with that. But if a dev comes in and says, hey, I'd like to light the other half of my candle now, Square Enix seems to be a company that says, yeah, that's fine. We'll light the candle at both ends. You asked us to. And so Ultimates, for example, in panels in the past at FanFest have been addressed as something that is very costly from a dev resources standpoint, in that once a developer does an Ultimate, they don't necessarily ever want to work on one again. Ever. So they burn devs pretty hard.
You look like you're actually going to die at your desk.
Oh no.
And it's like, there was one video from this is around, I think this was around one of the news things in like when they're talking about Versus 13 and his transition to 15. I remember just seeing him being being at a desk and delivering this thing to a camera, and I'm like, if if that's the take that they went, he looks fine, he's delivered that well, let's put that live. I'm like, how much makeup did they put on him? Is he actually just dead? Like, is he just dead at his desk? He was so grim looking. Like,
Oh man.
he was so grim looking. But
Yeah, it's like I see all this stuff and then I'm like, Japanese developers, please take a nap. Please,
Yeah.
Japanese bosses, please be nice to your workers, please.
I mean, you like, as I
'Cause
said,
I've seen all the.
yeah,
It's addressed regularly. Where Yoshi tells his team to take breaks, but then by example, he himself runs himself really hard. And so they talk about how it's hard to take breaks from something you're passionate in. And so the dev team as a whole has a history of overcommitting. There is something different about choosing to overcommit as opposed to being expected, but it doesn't make it any less dangerous long term.
Through just multiple YouTube channels, like give you a little bit of an insight into the darker side.
no good. Like,
Or the salary men who it's like they go to work and then they go drinking after work with their boss because they basically have to do that.
Performative drinking.
And then I've forgotten the name of them, but it's like the manga stores.
The manga cafes, yeah.
I forget the name of the manga cafes, but then they actually sleep in the manga cafe so they can get up because the manga cafe will be closer to the train station to get to work again. So it's like, whoa.
I think it's really dangerous long term. I think that it is one of the things we quote as the reason 14 is better. Working longer and working more passionately does not guarantee results. When they've had people come on who talk about the organization of where that work goes, how feedback gets calculated, when they've talked about that, there are some logistics that make that useful. Right now in front of my house, they are tearing down a tree. And as they tear down that tree, their chainsaw wouldn't start. So they're tearing it down with a bobcat. Now they're working very hard. I can see them getting out there and helping with hand tools. They're sweating. They're trying very hard. They're likely going to work on it more hours than the person with the chainsaw. But it's not going to change the fact that that tree was there this morning and it will not be there tonight. It's not going to change that. Not because they worked harder, not because they worked more passionately than a landscape company who came out and used the correct tool. So on its own, those are simply features. They don't have a benefit. They are just a description of what's going on. They work more hours because they choose to. Great. They work because they care about the game. Great. What makes 14 continue to have success is that they're very good at saying, okay, when somebody wants to work hard, when somebody wants to work passionately, we're capable of pivoting what team they work on. We're capable of pivoting where they go from here and helping them develop their careers. We're capable of investing in our people and managing our resources to funnel them to an end. And that's good business, right? So back to that restaurant metaphor, if that chef of yours wants to be a manager, are there opportunities when the business is slower that you can invite them to see, hey, come do inventory with me. Let's talk about what your job as a chef has as an impact on the rest of the company. We don't need to do it during crunch, but hey, like here's an opportunity where I can invest in you as a career so that when we open up another franchise of this restaurant, I can trust you to go over there in that promotion of the job you wanted anyways, and I can retain you. Final Fantasy does a great job of funneling the resources where they need to be. It is not simply passion and work ethic on its own that really distinguishes them. It's that's paired with the ability to use it.
Read some Berserk till you fall asleep. Have dreams of being cleaved in twain, like.
Yeah, and we were talking about the sort of broader Squeenix there, and we got Faldrin GW2 coming in saying, remember that Square supports the FF team as well, so there's a wombo combo for the FF team to get things done or fixed in a timely manner. Yeah, maybe it's that thing, they have a company structure where more people can just hop on that stuff to help them out, whereas maybe with WoW, they, perhaps because of employee onboarding and stuff, they can't just be like, okay, 9.1 really needs help, let's get some help in from across the company. Yeah. Maybe Blizzard aren't as able to do that.
It's funny because...
I couldn't tell you, obviously, but maybe.
It's funny because every time we see that in Western development, it seems to come across as a negative, like it's last resort. But I guess because we don't have the same lens into Japanese development in the same way, that we don't really know that so well.
Yeah.
I think there's a huge difference between in vanilla when Blizzard was pulling people off of StarCraft and Diablo projects to help with World of Warcraft because they needed it. There's a huge difference in what that translates to in the game than letting somebody write a story, because you have a lot of story that needs to get written and they want to get into that. I think there's a huge difference in developing resources versus just lending people. I don't want to be invested in this other department, and I'm being forced to go there because their job is behind and it's deemed as more important than what I was working on. So without behind the scenes knowledge of how these companies are doing that, I think the reason that it gets viewed badly with one company is that we assume it's forced, and with the other game, we assume it's a choice. If that's not true behind closed doors, then they're exactly the same.
Like if it does happen, or maybe they've actually planned for it by having all these cross I was about to say cross class, because that's what the cross class skills in FF14 used to be called. You've got all these cross class developers who are like, yeah, okay, yeah, I'm intimately familiar with how to use this, like use the FF14 pipeline. I'm on 16 at the minute, but I can downscale my work and, you know, hop over there for a couple weeks.
Yeah, it's like, can they do that? And then I guess in Blizz, it's like, even if they could do that, if it costs them D4 Overwatch 2, then maybe WoW just has to suffer, because as a company overall, they need D4 and Overwatch 2 out, perhaps.
Yep.
So, yeah, there's that.
Yeah, I don't know if this actually focused that much on what a PTR is versus how Final Fantasy content comes out, but honestly, the PTR itself is just a feature. It's not actually something that determines as much as what the result of a PTR is. A PTR itself is not something that any game needs. What a game needs is a way to hear from its player base and respond to its player base about changes that need to happen in the game and are wanted in the game. And so Final Fantasy does that through regular communication and being involved in the community of the game, not just as devs, but as players, publicly and regularly. Doesn't mean 14 devs don't play 14 while WoW devs also play WoW. It doesn't mean 14 devs don't play WoW and that WoW devs don't play 14. It's the fact that it is public and it is often and that it is transparent. And so when you look over at the PTR, that seems to be a tool that's designed to do all those same things in a very designated space. And when it fails to do that, there isn't a backup. We don't feel, whether or not they are, we don't feel that World of Warcraft devs are playing their own game. We don't feel that they're in our parties, that they're here. I've never actually played in a party with Yoshi P. I've never laid eyes on him in game. It's never happened. But I feel he's there. And that feeling is what determines how much trust we give them when they say, hang with us. We know things aren't perfect today, but they will be. When Final Fantasy goes through these moments where Ishgard Restoration was frustrated on launch, when we talk about points in history like Raubon Extreme, where there was a quest that we just simply couldn't get through, and it got nicknamed an Extreme because you were trying to clear it. When the Red Chocobo quest was wiping players off the map because of the way it spawned. When we talk about various bugs, people getting stuck on World Visit on other servers and being unable to return back home, so they couldn't access market boards, they couldn't play with their friends in some types of content. When we talk about these moments in Final Fantasy, they do happen. They do. But when they say, hey, we've got to fix this, hang with us, that's a friend, or at least what feels like a friend, asking, do you mind if I'm a few minutes late? That's not your boss or somebody that you rarely interact with asking for a favor as the first thing you've heard from them in months. The PTR is that place. The PTR is that bar, that pub that we can hang out with WoW devs. It's that place that we should be in there when something breaks, I should see somebody that has a dev symbol next to their name experiencing it with me. I should put in a feedback ticket and I should get a GM saying, hey, by the way, just wanted you to know we reached out to your thing this week. We should see more blue posts around the PTR that says, here's the things we're talking about this week. Here's what's going on internally. It doesn't need to be 2 live letters and 30 interviews like Final Fantasy. It doesn't need to be 3 fan fests. You don't have to copy their formula, but you do have to get to the end result. And so the PTR seems to be the tool that is best positioned to be that thing for World of Warcraft, where there could be a team that's responsible for taking what the players are saying and communicating it to devs, and just as importantly, taking what the devs are hearing and feeling and taking it back to those same players. Not the player base as a whole, who are happy to just play the game and don't care. I'm playing it with my friends every Tuesday. Yeah, it's not in a great state. I'm going to keep subbing anyway. The players who are taking time out of their day to play on a copy of their character that is not progressing, to share feedback with you about what they wish was better, those are your passionate evangelical fans. And letting them turn against you, letting them be frustrated and feel they're shouting into a void, when they've already proven to you that they are more vocal than their average portion of your player base, only guarantees that they will be more vocal about the way they complain, they will be more passionate about the way they quit, and that they will feel more ignored than somebody who never tried talking to you in the first place. The PTR is your place, WoW. You built it, you have it. There's no need to delete it and make a new tool. You have a place that's dedicated to this. Final Fantasy doesn't need one because they found a different way to get to the same result. I don't think the PTR on its own hurts or helps WoW. I think it's a tool. I think what hurts WoW is when they use that tool incorrectly. I think it's just different. And I think that it's very frustrating to see WoW in a rough state when they have possibly one of the best documented public test tools in the space. Final Fantasy doesn't need one because they got here without it. I don't know why they assume that players only playing on the PTR care about their game. Kinda.